Hello and welcome to The Future is Spoken, produced by the Digital Assistant Academy. This show accompanies the Digital Assistant Academy's course entitled Voice Interaction Design. Conversational AI assistants are evolving every day. As we identify more and more use cases for conversational AI, people have certain expectations and appetite with their bots. For any ongoing usage with conversational AI assistants, trust is crucial. But what does trust in voice assistant entail? In today's episode, Shyamala Praga speaks with Elaine Lee on building blocks of building trust. Elaine Lee is a designer specializing in artificial intelligence and machine learning, with a focus on ethical AI. She's currently a principal product designer at Twillio on the AI team, and previously led the design of eBay's AI-powered shopping assistant on Facebook Messenger and Google Assistant. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to The Future is Spoken. Today I have a very special guest, Elaine Lee, with me, and we are going to talk about designing a trustworthy voice assistant. Welcome, Elaine.
Thanks, Shamala. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. The weather's here is pretty good in San Francisco right now, so I'm happy about that.
Awesome. So, Elaine, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how did you get into conversation design?
Yeah, so I actually consider myself as a product designer. I started my design career in the advertising industry. So I didn't go to design school or art school. I actually studied psychology in undergrad and then also advertising in grad school. So I guess fasting forward to 2015, I joined a startup in San Francisco called Assembly Made. When I first joined, we weren't working in the conversational AI space or conversational experiences, but we quickly pivoted to a product that is essentially a Slack bot. And what it did was got people things in their office space. So for example, got people lunch or got them office supplies and things like that. When I first started in that space, it was quite exciting because it was very different from what I knew as a product designer, as an art director. It's totally different where we're working in the constraints of a Slack interface, for example. When we had to essentially stop working on that, I was still quite excited about the space because I felt like there's so much more that I can learn. And I only had a small taste of it. So at that time, eBay was actually looking for designers to work in that space as well, in the AI shopping assistant space. So I joined eBay, started working on that. The difference between what we were doing at Assembly Made and what I was doing at eBay is that Assembly Made, the bot that we were created was a hybrid bot. So essentially that was some of the conversation was automated and then it handed off to a human. Whereas at eBay, it was completely AI first. So that means there's never going to be a human to come to the rescue for any kind of fallback reasons. So that was a different type of design challenge there. And currently right now, I'm at Twillio on the platform side. So I worked on a product called AutoPilot, and essentially that is a conversational AI building platform for you to be able to build and train conversational AI experiences.
That's fascinating. So, Elaine, do you feel like your psychology background helped you in any way when you were designing these bots or when you are designing the experiences? Any thinking about the conversation in general or overall, like you mentioned, one was where you had a little bit of AI and then there was a handoff versus one where it was completely AI driven, where there was no handoff.
Yeah, I think actually the psychology background of mine helped me in all aspects of my design career, from anything from even the visual designs, the strategy behind it, to the conversational design. I think it's mainly because of the communication parts of it, of seaming together. How do we communicate with people? How do we engage with people to have them respond to what maybe your website, your app, or even your conversational bot is asking from the user to do? So I believe that part definitely helped in just thinking about the users a lot more and thinking deeper about what are some of those problems that they might have that we can solve for them.
So as a product manager, you also have to think about your users. So which is kind of a perfect blend for you then, because you have a background where you actually understand what the users think, do, but also using the same kind of things for your products, which is kind of amazing, right?
Yeah, definitely. I do see that some overlap between the product manager and the product designer role in regards to that, which only really helps build a better product. And then you have a more cohesive team where you're all kind of thinking about the same problem space, all trying to tackle the same thing.
Right, pretty much. So you mentioned you're with Twilio right now, and so could you tell our audience a little bit more about like what does Twilio do? Is it like designer centric product where people can create conversational flow, or it is more of a developer centric?
Oh, very great question. If you're around the Bay Area, you probably see a lot of these assets from Twilio saying like as your developer. So I think traditionally it's developer focused. So in general, Twilio is a cloud communications customer engagement platform. We essentially enable businesses to be able to communicate with their customers through different channels like text and voice, video, emails, and chat, WhatsApp, etc. I would say like specifically the product that I was working on, AutoPilot, is a platform for not just developers, but then people who maybe don't know as much code. I would consider them as like builders, for example. There's like maybe like a low code kind of interface where you'll be able to go in there and build conversational AI experiences as well. Or if you want to use the API, you can do that completely.
So is it like using your platform, people can design the conversational flows and deploy it wherever they want? Like you mentioned, it could be voice or a WhatsApp messenger or any such things.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So when you are like designing any kind of conversational AI applications, what kind of challenges do you face or think people will face?
Yeah, this is something that I kind of learned from both being at the startup and at eBay, and then now working at Twilio. I guess like a cohesive way. One of the hardest thing I believe is actually in training your bot to understand what the users are saying. So I feel like as designers in the conversational space, we can write out these like scripts and flows and say like this is a great happy path, but how do we get people to even trigger those like responses? And that comes with a lot of the training data, the training loop. So I would say like that's one of the hardest things. When we talk to clients, like one of the things that we kind of advise is like first start taking a look at your call logs, for example, maybe the call logs, transcripts, the support tickets, just to see how people are naturally talking about a certain topic, because they might not say things or use the same words that we think internally as our own business, for example. So how are other people expressing their concerns or what they want through their own language, and use that essentially to start the training set, to start training your bot to understand these are different ways that people are saying that to map to the same intent, same task that maybe your bot can achieve on. Yeah.
So how do one collect these kind of things? So for example, you mentioned you're training the bot to understand what the user has said. Now there are so many different ways the user can say the same thing, right? And when it comes to, let's say, for example, I keep bringing this example all the time, but weather. If you want to know the weather information, the user can ask what is the weather in California, or they can say, do I need an umbrella? Or they can say, will it rain today or will it snow? They can be more specific about certain things. Now, these are all different intents. In general, maybe the intent is the same, but the way it has been said is different, right? But for the machine to understand that these are all the same things, because in some cases, it's what is the weather or do I need an umbrella? But in some cases it is like will it rain, so now you're also adding that. So how do you actually then decide like how to train the system, and do you try to merge all of these different utterances, or do you try to like tweak it based on the user responses?
Great question. I would say like for anyone who's like starting out, they might have focus on certain type of intents and use cases. So let's just say like we start with like building what is the weather, and then trying to figure out like how are people asking specifically what the weather is versus like if it's going to rain or not. But just starting out with this like focus intent that offers value of like offering what is the actual weather, and then seeing from what else people are asking through your query logs, through like after you put this out into production, or even like you prototype this and give it to some people to test it out, just see how people are responding. What else are they asking that implies that they want to know the weather in some way, but then maybe not just like what the Fahrenheit or Celsius is, for example. So then from there, I would like to see it as like, if you do want to make it a little bit more robust and dynamic and smart, then do you then create a different task regarding, is it going to rain or is it going to storm, and map that into like a different type of response versus it always just responding with what the Fahrenheit or Celsius is.
Yeah, that is really important. Like you mentioned, like start with something first and then collect as much data through the logs and all, right? Which is kind of good because if someone is starting out new, maybe, they don't know all the possible ways. Although I've seen other people looking at different approaches. Like I personally do a lot of natural language studies myself, where we would do some sort of study with the users and ask them to tell us the different ways they would say a certain thing. That is another way which we have done. But I've seen most people mentioning like call logs could be a better way, or any analytics could be a better way of doing thing, which is really nice. Do you see a difference when it comes to a chatbot versus a voice bot, like in training the system this way?
Yeah. So like there's definitely the differences in the channels of having a chatbot versus a voice bot. And first, like I would like to take a step back in understanding, I guess, like what are those uniqueness of these different channels, and then how are people going to engage with your chatbot versus your voice bot, and essentially like in what scenarios would they choose one versus the other. So one of the principles that I'd like to have is like essentially not to translate your chatbot to the voice bot one-to-one, but really like leveraging the different uniqueness of each channel, and then can they become essentially complementary to each other versus like just the same experience, one on the surface, which is a chat, and then one on the voice. So I think like really understanding those differences and then how you want the user to be able to use either channel might affect, most likely would affect the training data. So just a quick one at the top of mind is like, so for a voice experience, there might be a lot of scenarios where there's like background noise. So what would that mean for the user experience? So maybe myself as a user, I might have missed what the voice bot said. So then we should anticipate that people might ask the voice bot to repeat itself in however many ways that they might say, like, please repeat, can you say that again? So that's one thing that we would need to be able to like train the bot to understand and then actually repeat what it last said. Versus in a chatbot, people can come back to it later and answer that question or take that next turn. So there isn't that urgency there where someone might need to ask the bot to repeat itself because they can scroll through the logs and then read essentially what happened in the sense.
Yeah, I like that. Definitely, I feel like what you mentioned is a very important part here that, well, you cannot completely replicate chat to voice, right? They are two different modalities, although there may be some similarities. People are trying to get the same information, but then there's a lot different when it comes to the platform, right? One is for voice, the other is for text. Could you talk a little bit more about, that? I know we spoke about this a few times, so I'm really interested and curious to know about what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I can use some examples from when I was working on the eBay shopping assistant, because we did start off building that in Facebook Messenger, and so that was essentially a surface type of experience, and we can leverage a lot of visuals, carousels, links, and a lot of the things that people might need in a personal shopping kind of experience. And when we started working on the voice experience inside of Google Assistant, like the home, and that very quickly we know that it will be very difficult to like surface an image, because at that time there wasn't the Surface and speaker. It was just like the Google Home at that time. So then how do we create a similar experience with just voice? So we had to essentially figure out like what are those key information that we can tell the user that's valuable to them through voice. And then we did like a link to their app, a Google Assistant app, for them to like essentially look at the imagery and make a decision there. So we kind of carry the conversation to the Surface experience there. But I think the difference is that for the Surface experience, if you just start from there in the beginning, you can present the user with a lot more information, and they can like decide, what to look at, what to pay attention to. Whereas in the voice experience, like we have to really break it down to what is actually essential for the user to know right now, for them to continue the conversation, for them to move on to the next step.
That's an important part, especially when designing chat. Of course, you have so much options available in front of you. Like you mentioned, you have, like, you can show a list or you can show some sort of carousel or things like that. Now, there are, with voice, of course, like you mentioned, there are challenges involved, like some of those you cannot show. So there are alternatives, like you mentioned. Now, there are some times, like if it was a voice first only approach where there's no option at all for you to have a screen, like smart speakers nowadays, they don't have as much. Like if you don't have a screen kind of approach, then what kind of challenges do you see design solutions probably?
Yeah, so I know you're a complete expert in the space, in the voice space. So some of the things that maybe top of mind for me is the window when someone can respond to the voice experience is really short. Do you agree with that? Yeah, it's very short.
Yeah.
So then even when I'm playing with my Google Home, I when I invoke the Google Home, I feel like, oh, I forgot what I was going to ask it. And I wanted to like think really quick of like how to respond to it before the mic shuts off for privacy reasons and for reasons like that. So one thing that I would like to keep in mind is that whatever we ask the user, it has to be easy for them to understand without them needing to do a little bit more extra work on the side to figure out like, what are you trying to ask me? And then the options that we offer have to be succinct and short enough and distinct enough for someone to be able to make that choice pretty quickly as well. So those are some of the things that I was keeping in mind of like just really focusing on what kind of experience we can give to the user so that they feel comfortable answering and the conversation feels a little bit more natural and we don't try to like, I guess, like intrude too much in having robust type of conversations because perhaps like they can't necessarily speed up what we're saying from the business side, like our boss,
Yeah.
like they can't like say, come on, hurry up, get to the point. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. What you're saying makes so much sense. And it happens so many times, like the user could actually say something. So the voice session started, and then now maybe if the user is speaking for the first time, they don't know what to say. So there's no response at all, like you mentioned. And then how do you design a solution which will help them? Or maybe they are in between the conversation, they're ordering a pizza or something. Now they are not clear on what they want and they are seeking help from their partner, like, honey, which pizza do you have? So like you mentioned, it's really like that small window which we have before the voice session ends. So do we just end the voice session or do we continue the conversation and ask the user a little bit more escalating details, which is kind of fascinating. It can go into any direction. So which is nice. As you are saying, with chatbot, I feel like you can have the session open and the chatbot could continue, but with voice, there are challenges, right? Yeah, true. Elaine, you've been, like, I read your article as well, and you've been talking about designing trust through bots a lot. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So I believe that one of the challenges is building that trust between your voice and chat AI bot and the end user. There's like essentially high expectations of like what these chatbots and voice bots can do, especially during the hype cycle when all of this was like in the media. So then there's like super high expectations, and then a lot of people realize like, oh, it can't do X, Y, Z. It's not as smart as we think it is. And I think that comes with some things like not just maybe not setting up the right expectations to begin with. So I would like to talk a little bit about like why building that trust. Building that trust essentially increases engagement between your bot and your end user. And then with that engagement, you would end up getting a lot more data for you to be able to train your bot to become more relevant and smarter. Then you can offer more value to your end users. And then with that, like it just leads back into the trust. So then it can become a cycle then where you build this like trust between the end user and your bot, and they would just keep repeatedly use your experience. And so, like I mentioned, like top of the funnel, I think like setting up the right expectation of how people should engage with your bot, as well as like what your bot, your conversational AI experience, your assistant is really good at. Like, what is the actual value that you want to deliver to the end user? What can you not deliver? Be very explicit about those things, either partly upfront, but then also throughout the experience. When you see certain conversations go awry, go into a direction where you know that your bot cannot handle, or you that your bot does not support that category or that ask, like how do you bring them back to what you're really good at? So having that type of experience, not just upfront, but throughout the whole experience, throughout the whole flow, would be essential. And a couple more things that I can add to that. Like one thing is that I really love is the concept of echoing back. And what I mean by that is like if the user asks for something, pick out those like key phrases, key fields that they use, and then try to repeat back, echo back what they ask for. And this is for a couple of reasons. Like one, you want to show that you heard what the user said, and then perhaps like you heard them correctly. But then it also gives them a chance to understand that, oh, maybe the bot did not hear me correctly. It repeated back something different. So it'll give me as a user a chance for me to like course correct that. Say like basically like maybe the bot heard blue hat and then but I meant blue mat or something like that. So then I can like cut in and essentially course correct that. Yeah, I would say like lastly that I want to point out is the concept of like anticipating for everything. This goes back to the whole training data portion. So what I kind of understood from my experience is that when you want to only listen to when you want the bot to only listen to what it wants to listen to because it's asking you like say what size do you want, and then it's like trying to listen for a size, but it's not really remembering that, oh, the user might be saying something else. They might like divert the conversation. There might be background noise. There might be negative or positive feedback, things like that. All these other scenarios that might happen, if we don't design for them, it's very easy for the bot to go to a fallback. And then it'll just get into a loop of being in a fallback loop where it says, I don't understand you or something like that, which I think in the beginning, it's fine. When you're building this out, prototyping, testing it, it's fine. And just pay attention to like what people are actually saying, then realize like, oh, okay, there are these scenarios where someone just wants to like cut to a different topic. How do you handle that? And what is that flow like? And then if they give you positive or negative feedback in the middle of this like turn here, how do you handle that as well? And then do you bring them back to the original question that you asked them? And so just keeping in mind of like all these things that you don't want to hear at that moment and creating flows for them, creating an experience for that user.
There are so many things, wow, for someone to consider when they are thinking about designing the dialogue system, right? Some of the things which you mentioned is actually pretty normal, like that happens day in and day out with the bot experiences. So how can, so for example, there could be situations where, disambiguations, you said play Michael Jackson. Now Michael Jackson could be an artist, album, song title, or something else, right? Or let's say the user said, open Delta. Now Delta could be an Delta app, or like the Delta Airlines, or it could be Delta something else, right? So in those situations, like how can someone design for trust, keeping these kind of things in mind? Like now, if the bot asks the user, like, did you mean Michael Jackson artist, album, or song title, and continue the conversation, versus assuming like, okay, maybe you've been hearing to Michael Jackson album all the time, so maybe I should play that. Do you see that these kind of minute things can also make or break the trust with the users?
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point of like, if you already have certain data about the user behavior, which also means like the user has been using your bot for a while now, that's definitely something that if you can leverage for any privacy reason, you can, whatever data that you can leverage to enhance their experience, that can only increase the trust where now the user has to do less work. So why are we having these like voice assistants, voice bots, and chatbots? Perhaps it's to help enhance like what we're doing every day right now. So if we can like lower the barrier for the user, have them do less work, and then have these like assistants do more work, that is ultimately one of the goals, right? So then I do agree with you in leveraging some of those like user patterns and user data. And then eventually then we won't have to ask those like clarifying questions, and we can let the user to clarify it themselves if they feel like, oh, this isn't actually what I want. So that's a way of going about it as well. If you don't have that data, something that we offer on AutoPilot is like a confidence score of like how well it thinks that it's mapping to a certain intent. And then that's where you can offer, like, figure out like the threshold where should we ask a clarifying question if the confidence score is like low, for example, just to clarify it so that we're not always giving irrelevant information to the user. That is something I feel like we would have to just like test out depending on what your experiences that you're trying to offer to the user.
That is really interesting. And I feel like you brought up a really good point of testing, which is important. I've been like in arguments with the development team, or not argument, but more like a constructive back and forth discussion between the team in the past, where we were looking at, disambiguations very closely and thinking about when should we assume versus when should we ask the user, so that we don't. So there's a very fine balance between building trust versus sounding dumb as well. Now, if you keep asking everything to the voice assistant, then maybe people will get frustrated, like, it doesn't know, I want to. So, like, my voice assistant does that all the time in the car. I have a non-phone brand. I will not name it out, but then every time I say call husband, like his. So basically, like the way I have saved is my husband's India number. I also have a number which usually every time we go to India, we use it. And then I have one with his US number. So, and I've saved his name as Mogudu US. Mogudu in my language means husband. Okay. So it never understands it because that is a alien language for the voice assistant. So what it would do is every time I say call Mogudu US, it would actually show me, because it understands US all the time, right? That is an English word. So it would show me a list of all the contacts I have with the name US in the end. So it could be my friend from like US or whatever. So I do have people who moved here from India. So I have two numbers for them as well. Now it keeps showing that. So initially I was fine with that because it showed me all that. And I knew that the assistant is not able to understand like which one I meant. Now, every day when I commute, I keep doing that. I keep asking the assistant, and it keeps making the mistake. And sometimes, even after telling, like, call the first one, it would make mistakes and call some random people. And I'm in between the ride, I'm like trying to cancel the voice session and the call, which is a different story. But then in these situations, like I was like, well, if my voice assistant knew that this is the only person I call every time during my ride, and then can just make that call for me, then fine. But then the development team was like, what if that once you wanted to call some other person and not this person? And because the disambiguation picked, assumed that you want to call the same person, now you're all screwed. So what's your take on experience like this?
Yeah, I think like it sounds like there's one, like how urgent it is that you need to reach a certain person, and then what are the issues if like it got it wrong. Is it going to be a big problem if it got it wrong? I know like that's one of the anxieties I have when I was using any kind of voice assistant where I accidentally started calling someone that I don't even know who it is, but they're just in my address book. I was like, who is this? So I'm trying to like hang up immediately because that would be really awkward. So yeah, I think like for me, if the issue of getting it wrong is high and the urgency is high, I probably will be a little bit more conservative in guessing the right answer and trying to make sure the user is navigating themselves to the right answer. Whereas like for something like a shopping assistant where we're creating this like browsing behavior and things like that, we did test this a lot of like how quickly do we show a response versus like how many more aspects do we need to know from the user before we show them a relevant response, like how many turns do we need. And there comes to be a point where someone just like wants to stop the conversation, and there comes to be a point where someone just wants the results immediately. So, but I feel like in that scenario, there is less urgency than if you needed to really call the insurance company because you're in a car accident or something like that, or you need to call the right person immediately, where it just breaks into your actual workflow. If you get to the wrong person, then you're like, forget it, I'm just going to pick up the phone and pull over and dial and things like that instead, which then perhaps there would be a drop off from using that experience.
Yeah, I feel like that's relevant use case by use case, right? Like if it is a high stake or high risk kind of use case, then choose your battles, like how you want to design for it, which is interesting. Now, what are the additional? I know you mentioned building trust through dialogue, right? And the entire different kind of situations which can occur. It could be introductions or disambiguations or confirmations and all sorts of things. What are the additional building blocks of building trust with a bot?
Yeah, I would say like I kind of mentioned it's a little bit related to anticipating for everything. Essentially, how do you get people back onto the right track when they go off the rails? Like maybe they are asking for something that your bot does not, or your conversational experience does not offer. How are you going to be transparent about that versus like going to a generic fallback? Like any of these like moments where you can be a little bit more transparent about what the bot can do at that moment, and then offer like how else can the bot essentially solve that problem for the user that they're asking for. And being transparent about all of that is critical. So for example, if say your bot is something that orders things for people in I guess it's a hotel bot. Let's just say it's a hotel bot, but it can only do one or two things really well. One thing is essentially ordering your room service, and then another thing is like bringing you amenities. But then because it's like a hotel concierge bot or something like that, someone might ask like, can you order me a taxi or a car somewhere, or ask directions for something? And like, how do you have that conversation with the user? Because like, not not only if like you just set up the expectation in the beginning, maybe the user just forgot that you can't do that. Like, yeah, you did the due diligence of like, oh, I'm a hotel concierge bot. I can only give you like room service or amenities, and that's it, right? But you as a user, you might not remember that because we're not going to remember everything that the bot tells us. So then how do we remind the user that, oh, I can actually do that, but I can do these things for you? And then perhaps like, do you then route them to a human? Do you want to route them to a human, like someone in the front desk to order them? Or do you have a different workflow to like contact the front desk for them to then call you or something like that? Some other way, if you can think of all these different scenarios to handle like unsupported categories, like how else can you help them if it's not through this like voice experience?
Yeah, that's important. You mentioned expectation setting, which is so important. Like, otherwise, people would be wanting to ask all sorts of things with the bot. How about transparency? Like, I've seen this happening a lot, and Google Duplex is a classic example. And I keep bringing that because Google Duplex can call, other users on behalf of the actual user to book, appointments, right? And what it does is, I was looking at this demo where this bot would actually call I think it was a spa or salon, someone,
Mhm.
and the duplex bot is like, hey, by the way, I'm calling on behalf of a client who wants to book a haircut, blah 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 blah, and all of those things. And she had like so much of expressions and emotions, including the and all of those things. And nowhere throughout the conversation it said like, I'm a bot. So the other person was talking to it thinking like it's a human on the other side. So how about the transparency piece of things when designing bots? Like, do you think that
Yeah.
can make or break the trust?
Yeah, I do definitely feel that if you sound more human, people are just going to expect more from your bot. They're going to expect that it is as smart as a human. And if we can't actually deliver on that, then are you then setting up your bot for success in that conversation and then in the future? So I would say like some of the tactics that we kind of figured out when I was at the startup, not even at eBay, was like we realized people didn't know if we were humans or a bot because we sounded really smart because we were humans. So like that was before we started kind of automating certain things to become more parts of the conversation was actually a bot and then parts of it was a human. So we became a lot more explicit that we are a hybrid, and so essentially part bot, part human. And I think like just understanding how to sound more like a bot in some ways helps with that experience versus sounding more like a human, because I feel like when we sounded more like a human in some ways, people just expected more than we can deliver. So I think we had to, at that time, make a decision on like, how do we shape the experience and learn from it by not having people like ask us for things that, you know, that the bot cannot handle, and making sure that they understand that this is actually automated in this portion, and then now they're talking to an actual human. And for eBay, like we were very explicit that it was a chatbot, and essentially they kind of know it through some of the fallback messages. Like if they're asking for something a lot more complex, there are fallback messages. So those are pretty explicit around there. I would say like being more transparent is better in most use cases, so that essentially you can then build that trust between your end users and your experience.
Yeah, this is amazing. There are so many things to consider, whether it is a chatbot or a voice bot, to look at all those minute things like the pieces of the conversation or other elements as well, which is really fascinating. So, what do you care the most when you are designing a conversation experience?
Yeah, I care about essentially what is that problem that I'm trying to solve that is through a conversational experience that is better than the status quo today. And the status quo today isn't necessarily other voice and chat bots. They are actually the websites and apps, and even picking up a phone and calling someone. So I feel like just really honing down on like being able to say, well, this experience right now, currently in the status quo, is not great, but it can be better through this voice or chat experience. As top of funnel, that would be one thing that would be like crucial to figuring out if people would actually use this experience or not.
Yeah, knowing your use cases and the problem you're trying to solve is really important. Yeah. How about target audiences? Do you really think that can make or break the experience if you're thinking about them upfront?
Yeah, very great question. I think there's like always like certain target audiences that we would come up with, and like, yeah, this is for this person, this person, this person. But then when you see people using it, you have to reevaluate, is this meeting the right person that we thought we're trying to target? Who's actually using this experience? I think like in the beginning when we were testing out these experiences, more technically savvy people at that time, people who were just like more interested in this like space, were using the experience more so than the wider general population that maybe we thought that we were trying to target. So that would come with like essentially figuring out, do we optimize for that current user, or do we try to like keep building for this other user that we have in mind? We can't disregard necessarily the people who are actually using it, because like I mentioned, that engagement is what's going to give you some training data as well, and then also to prove if people want to use your experience or not. So if I had to make a hard decision, I probably would still try to learn from the active users who are using it, even though they're not necessarily the original target user that I have in mind. And then try to figure out like, should the target user change just based on what the market wants? Like, who are the people who are actually wanting this?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think that's a very fair point. And I was just talking to Heidi some time back, and what she mentioned was like, well, Amazon was designed for everyone, but typically like when they designed, I don't know what target audiences they had in mind, but kids and the older generation were the most who were using it, right? So gradually they had to go back and look at variations of the product to cater to that kind of audience as well, because it was not originally thought about in the first place. So it is apt with what you are saying here, that you may think about a specific target audience, but they may not be the only target audience for you when you're designing. So when you have the data, start testing and see what kind of audiences you have, which is very reasonable kind of approach, I feel. Yeah. Cool. So, Elaine, what is that one thing? I know there may be many, but what is that one, wish you knew when you started in this space?
Yeah. That one thing that I wish I knew was that what I was doing is actually design. So what I mean by that is that when I first started working in the space, I didn't know if what I was doing was design, because what I knew of design in my own experience is more on the visual side, coming from like visual product design and then also essentially like art direction. So all things visual communication. And when I started working more in just like conversational space, it did make me wonder, like, am I doing designing? Am I writing? Am I like just doing flows? I was a little bit confused, but then I quickly just like, well, like, yeah, whatever. This is really exciting. This is really challenging. And I just wanted to like keep going at it and keep learning from it. And I definitely convinced myself, and I believe it too, that conversational design, now that there is a term for these designers, like it is design. And maybe you might be using words more than you're using visuals, but it is all part design. And I wasn't necessarily designing myself out of a job either, because that was like another thing that I was thinking of. And I would say it's completely opposite. It definitely opened up more opportunities for me, like not just opportunities that are growing, but then it's just my eyes to more opportunities. Not, my eyes are open to like, there's so many other opportunities in this space, in this AI space, for a designer to be a part of, and this conversational space as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Yeah, I mean, definitely design has so many different facets nowadays, and conversation design is one of them, and a challenging one for sure, an interesting one as well,
Yeah.
which is nice. So, what advice would you give to any aspiring or new designers who want to get into the space?
Yeah, I think one of my big advice is like essentially to keep prototyping, and prototype not just through scripts and reading them out, but trying to use a platform to for you to be able to like put that conversation in place, train certain intents, and then start chatting or like talking to your voice bot to see like how are things being played back, how is this conversation feeling. That part would be crucial, because I've tried from both sides, where it was in the beginning before there were all these tools, like it was a lot of flat mockups, and I was like, this isn't really working as well for testing scenarios, because it's hard for people to type in exactly what they want or say exactly what they want. So what we ended up doing is like creating a dev environment just to have that experience so we can test it with people. But I think like right now you can do that on your own. You don't necessarily need a design or development team to create the bot experience in dev environment for you to take it out to users. You can use a lot of different platforms, like say for AutoPilot, you can use that to quickly like input certain tasks and then also like write phrases and things like that for you to train it, just to test out how the conversation feels. Obviously, like you won't just leave it as that, but you need a lot more training data. But then at the same time, you can potentially give it to a friend, give it to a couple of people, like, hey, text this bot and start chatting with it. And then start seeing that log of conversations, see like how are people trying to communicate with your bot and things like that. So there are many quick ways for you to test out your conversational flows in that way.
Yeah. What else could be the better way of learning something, testing it out, experimenting it out? So, yeah, this is great advice. Thank you so much. Anything else, any last words you would want to have with our listeners?
Yeah, this space is quite challenging, and just don't be discouraged by like the bot sounding dumb or like not understanding certain things, because there are high expectations of AI and what it can do, and then also mixed feelings about it because people have been burned by it, thinking like, oh, this isn't really smart and things like that. I think like this is definitely something that is hard to do, and we're just at the beginning of it. Even though say I've been doing it for 5 years, we're still just at the beginning of it. I mean, you've been doing it for much longer, and there's so much more that we can learn, and and do and like understand like the training data and things like that. Yeah.
Definitely, definitely. Wow, it has been a pleasure talking with you, Elaine. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today. If you would like to post a voice comment, please go to www.witlingo.com/daa. That's www.witlingo.com/daa. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can find all the information on becoming a certified voice interaction designer, along with show notes and more at our website, digitalassistant.academy. That's digitalassistant.academy. We encourage your feedback and questions. Be sure to get in touch by using the contact page at the Digital Assistant Academy's website. We will include the link in the show notes. In our next episode, Jeff Adams, CEO of Cobalt Speech and Language, talks about art of crafting natural conversations. Until next week, take care.